Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling one of the biggest puzzles in all of psychiatry, the biological cause of bipolar disorder.
Now, bipolar disorder, it affects about 1% of the population. And, while we've known for decades that genes are a big part of the story, the actual precise biological why has been, it's been a total mystery. But what if the answer isn't just about our genes? A really compelling hypothesis, one that's been building for years, suggests the answer is actually hiding inside the tiny, microscopic engines that power every single one of our brain cells. Okay, let's really get into this.
So, to really wrap our heads around this, we first need to meet our primary suspect, the mitochondrion.
Okay, so most of us, right? We probably remember from high school biology class that mitochondria are the power plants of the cell. They are these tiny little engines, just constantly churning out the energy currency called ATP, and that stuff fuels literally everything a cell needs to do to survive. But here's the thing that's super critical for the brain, and it's their second, less famous job. They also act as calcium buffers. That means they soak up and release calcium ions to help regulate the signals firing between neurons. So think about it. They're not just supplying the power, they're also helping to flip the switches. And having this dual role in both energy and communication, that makes them a prime suspect in a brain disorder.
All right, so if faulty mitochondria are our main suspect, what's the actual evidence? Well, investigators have been building a case, piece by piece, by following three main lines of inquiry. So, the very first clue. This actually dates all the way back to the 1990s. And it came from looking directly at how the brains of patients with bipolar disorder were using energy.
Yeah, using this really cool brain scanning technique called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS for short, study after study found these clear signs that the brain's whole energy system was under a lot of stress. I mean, they were seeing things like lower energy reserves and higher levels of lactate, which is a chemical byproduct that just builds up when cells can't make energy the right way. So basically, the brain scans were showing a cellular power grid that was really struggling to keep the lights on.
Next up, the scientific detectives started looking for genetic fingerprints. But, like any good mystery, the case file here is, it's a little complicated. It's got some twists.
So, at first, some early, smaller studies pointed to certain mutations in genes that are related to how mitochondria work. But then, when much larger studies came along and tried to find those same links, they just couldn't confirm them. But wait, a different and really fascinating genetic clue popped up instead. Researchers found an increase in something called somatic mutations. Now, these aren't the genes you inherit, they're mutations you pick up over your lifetime, and they were found in the mitochondrial DNA itself. This was a huge hint that maybe these cellular engines are actually getting damaged over time during the illness.
But maybe the most powerful clue of all comes from this incredible breakthrough technology, something that lets scientists essentially recreate the entire scene of the crime right there in a lab dish.
So check this out. In a landmark study back in 2015, scientists took regular skin cells from patients with bipolar disorder. They then did this amazing thing where they turned them back into stem cells and then guided those to grow into brain cells right there in a dish. And the result? It was absolutely striking. The neurons that came from the patients were what we call hyperexcitable. They fired way, way too easily. It's kind of like a car engine that just revs into the red line with the absolute slightest touch of the gas.
And here's the real kicker. When the researchers added lithium, which is, the gold standard treatment for bipolar disorder, it completely normalized that hyperexcitability. It calmed the cells right down. But, and this is so important, it only worked on the cells that came from patients who actually respond to lithium in real life. I mean, this was just a stunning confirmation, directly linking a problem at the cellular level to a real-world clinical treatment.
Okay, so if this whole power plant theory is on the right track, it should also help us explain some of the other really puzzling things we see with bipolar disorder, right? Well, as it turns out, the connections are surprisingly strong. First off, just look at the incredible overlap with known mitochondrial diseases. We're talking about conditions where we know for a fact that the cell's power plants are the main problem. Well, in studies of these patients, as many as 1 in 5 also have bipolar disorder.
That's an association nearly 8 times higher than what you'd see in the general population. I mean, that is a massive statistical red flag that you just can't ignore.
And what about this? The mitochondrial hypothesis might also solve another huge long-standing mystery. Why do we so consistently see elevated inflammation in people with bipolar disorder?
Well, it turns out that when mitochondria get damaged, they can actually spring a leak, and their own DNA spills out into the cell. Now, here's the crazy part. To our immune system, that mitochondrial DNA looks a lot like bacterial DNA. So the body mistakes it for a foreign invader and launches an attack. And what does that do? It triggers the exact inflammatory response and the spike in chemicals called cytokines that we see in patients. It's a perfect match.
And this right here, this is the crucial point. This whole mitochondrial idea gives us a single unifying framework that could finally explain how our main treatments actually work. Because think about it, these drugs were discovered decades apart, and they seem totally unrelated. But maybe lithium is fixing the calcium signaling. And maybe the anticonvulsants are calming down that hyperexcitability that results from it. And the antipsychotics? They're soothing the overactive brain circuits that are firing because of all this chaos. They might all be tackling the same core energy problem, just from different angles.
So yeah, the evidence is pretty compelling, right? But this investigation is far from over. In fact, this whole new way of understanding the problem is pointing us toward completely new ways to treat it.
You know, for the last century, a lot of psychiatric treatments were discovered pretty much by accident. But now, instead of just hoping to get lucky, scientists can rationally design drugs that directly target these cellular engines. For instance, they've already identified a specific protein complex on the surface of the mitochondria. It's called the MPTP, and they think it's a key weak point. They've even found compounds that hit this target and actually improve mood-related behaviors in animal models. This is what targeted modern drug discovery looks like.
And the research is getting even more precise. Investigators are now zeroing in on a specific brain region called the paraventricular thalamus, or PVT. Why? Because this seems to be where the mitochondrial damage really builds up, at least in animal models. It gives scientists a specific crime scene to focus on, to study, and to hopefully target with treatments down the line.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought, doesn't it? After all these decades of searching for the biological roots of bipolar disorder, what if the key to stabilizing mood isn't just some simple chemical fix? What if it's something much, much more fundamental? What if it's all about stabilizing the tiny little engines that power our minds?